Chapter 26. Trade. The Case for Fair Trade. Peter Navarro. For decades, the world has struggled with a shifting maze of punitive tariffs, export subsidies, quotas, dollar-locked currencies, and the like. Many of these import-inhibiting and export-encouraging devices have long been employed by major exporting countries trying to amass ever larger trade surpluses. Warren Buffett, CEO, Berkshire Hathaway. The Chinese government is implementing a comprehensive, long-term industrial strategy to ensure its global dominance. Beijing's ultimate goal is for domestic companies to replace foreign companies as designers and manufacturers of key technology and products first at home, then abroad. U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. The United States of America is the world's dominant superpower and remains the world's arsenal of democracy. To maintain that global positioning and thereby best protect the homeland and our own democratic institutions, it is critical that the United States strengthen its manufacturing and defense industrial base at the same time that it increases the reliability and resilience of its globally dispersed supply chains. That will necessarily require the onshoring of a significant portion of production currently offshored by American multinational corporations. Trade policy can and must play an essential role in an American manufacturing and defense industrial base renaissance. However, several major challenges in the international trading environment are pushing America in the opposite direction. The first challenge is rooted in MFN, the most favored nation rule of the World Trade Organization, WTO. According to the MFN rule, WTO members must apply the lowest tariffs that they apply to the products of any one country to the products of every other country. However, WTO members can charge higher tariffs if they apply these non-reciprocal tariffs to all countries. The practical result has been the systematic exploitation of American farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and workers through higher tariffs institutionalized by MFN. In turn, this unfair and non-reciprocal trade has resulted in chronic U.S. trade deficits with much of the rest of the world. This systemic trade imbalance serves as a brake and bridle on both GDP growth and real wages in the American economy while encumbering the U.S. with significant foreign debt. The second challenge is part of the broader existential threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in its quest for global dominance. That challenge is rooted in the CCP's continued economic aggression, which begins with mercantilist and protectionist trade policy tools such as tariffs, non-tariff barriers, dumping, counterfeiting, and piracy, and currency manipulation. However, Communist China's economic aggression also extends to an intricate set of industrial policies and technology transfer forcing policies that have dramatically skewed the international trading arena. Both the unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal trade institutionalized by the WTO and Communist China's economic aggression are weakening America's manufacturing and defense industrial base, even as the fragility of globally dispersed supply chains has been brought into sharp relief by the COVID-19 pandemic, with its associated lockdowns and other disruptions, and by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian revanchism, in particular, has demonstrated once again how bad actors on the world stage can use trade policy, for example, export restraints on natural gas, as a weapon of war. Laying the trade deficit predicate. The great football coach Bill Parcells once said, "You are what your record says you are." America's record on trade specifically America's chronic and ever expanding trade deficit, says that America is the globe's biggest trade loser and a victim of unfair, unbalanced, and non reciprocal trade. During the first year of the Biden administration, the overall U.S. trade deficit, including goods and services, soared by 29%, from $654 billion in 2020 to $845 billion in 2021. Over the same time period, imports of consumer goods, capital goods, and the category of foods, feeds, and beverages were the highest on record, and imports of industrial supplies and materials were the highest since 2014. As for the U.S. trade deficit in goods, which primarily measures manufacturing output, Table 1 catalogs that deficit for the top 13 countries, plus the European Union, EU, in fiscal year FY 2022. Note that the trade deficit in goods with Communist China is by far the largest. It accounts for fully one-third of that deficit and is more than twice the size of the deficit with the EU. Capital goods and the category of foods, feeds, and beverages were the highest on record, and imports of industrial supplies and materials were the highest since 2014. As for the U.S. trade deficit in goods, which primarily measures manufacturing output, Table 1 catalogs that deficit for the top 13 countries, plus the European Union, EU, in fiscal year FY 2022. Note that the trade deficit in goods with Communist China is by far the largest. It accounts for fully one-third of that deficit and is more than twice the size of the deficit with the EU. These trade deficit statistics implicitly measure the large amounts of America's manufacturing and defense industrial base and supply chains that have been offshored to foreign lands. Such offshoring not only suppresses the real wages of American blue-collar workers and denies millions of Americans the opportunity to climb up the rungs of the ladder to the middle class, but also raises the specter of a manufacturing and defense industrial base that, unlike our experience in World Wars I and II, will not be able to provide the weapons and material that would be needed should America enter another major world war or seek to assist a major ally like Europe, Japan, or Taiwan. It is wise to recall Stalin's admonition that quantity has a quality of its own. In World War II in particular, it was not just the brave soldiers, sailors, and pilots who beat the Nazis and Imperial Japan. It was America's factories, its arsenal of democracy, that overwhelmed the Axis forces. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, almost certainly spawned in a CCP biological weapons lab in Wuhan, China, global supply chains have been under significant pressures from lockdown policies, energy price shocks, and other disruptions, including labor market disruptions. At the height of the pandemic, the rising geopolitical risk associated with globalized supply chains was underscored when Communist China, which controls much of the world's pharmaceutical production and supply chains, threatened to plunge America into a mighty sea of coronavirus through pharmaceutical export controls if American politicians dared to investigate what happened at the Wuhan lab. Add all this up, and America's trade situation and massive trade imbalances pose not only a severe economic security threat, but also a national security threat. As President Donald Trump indicated in announcing his 2017 national security strategy, economic security is national security. Challenge. Sir 1. Unfair and non-reciprocal trade institutionalized in W2 rules. Tonight, I am also asking you to pass the United States Reciprocal Trade Act so that if another country places an unfair tariff on an American product, we can charge them the exact same tariff on the exact same product that they sell to us. President Donald J. Trump, 2019 State of the Union Address. The World Trade Organization with its 164 members, governs international trade rules. Under its most favored nation MFN rule, each WTO member must apply the lowest tariffs. It applies to the products of any one country to the products of every other WTO country. Importantly, nothing in the MFN rule requires a WTO member to provide equal, that is, reciprocal or mirror tariff rates to its trading partners. Rather, under MFN, WTO members can charge systematically higher tariffs to other countries to the extent negotiated in their WTO tariff schedules, so long as they apply those same higher tariffs to all countries. As a poster child for the kind of non-reciprocal tariffs that American manufacturers often face, the MFN tariff for automobiles applied by the U.S. is only 2.5%. In contrast, the EU charges 10%, Communist China 15%, and Brazil 35%. Similarly, while the U.S. applies an MFN tariff rate of 6.2% on the rice it buys from Malaysia, Malaysia applies an ad valorem equivalent tariff of 40% on rice from the U.S. Meanwhile, European milk producers are shielded. From the perspective of strategic game theory, the WTO's MFN rule provides little or no incentive for higher tariff countries to lower their tariffs. Rather, under these conditions, the dominant strategy of any relatively high tariff country is simply to maintain those high tariffs while free riding off the lower tariff countries. The U.S. is disproportionately harmed by the WTO's non-reciprocal tariff regime. The countries that are hurt most by the WTO's non-reciprocal tariff regime are those like the United States that charge the lowest tariffs on average. This point is illustrated in Table 2, which reports information on non-reciprocal tariffs that are applied under the MFN rule on product lines at the 6-digit level of the Harmonized Commodity Description and Coding System, HS6. Table 2 presents results for a broad sample of 132 countries that account for more than 60% of total U.S. trade and 98% of U.S. trade that is not covered by free trade agreements, FTAs. Within this broad sample of 132 countries, U.S. exporters face higher tariffs in 467,015 different cases compared to 141,236 cases in which the U.S. charges higher non-reciprocal rates. In other words, U.S. exporters face higher tariffs more than 3 times as often as the U.S. applies higher tariffs. Moreover, when American exporters face higher tariffs, the non-reciprocal tariffs are typically much higher. As row 4 of Table 2 indicates, in the 467,015 cases in which foreign partners charge higher tariffs, the average rate applied by the foreign partners is 12.3 percentage points above the rate applied by the U.S. In contrast, in the 141,736 cases in which the U.S. charges the higher tariff, the average U.S. applied rate is only 8.7 percentage points higher than the average applied tariff of the foreign partner. Separately, Communist China levies higher tariffs on 10 products for every one Chinese product that is subject to a U.S. applied higher tariff. India's ratio is even higher at 13-1. Further, both Communist China and India also feature significant non-tariff barriers. Collectively, these higher non-reciprocal tariffs in Communist China and India block American exporters from selling goods at competitive prices to more than 1/3 of the world's population. Trade deficit impacts of the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Act. Under current United States laws and regulations, an American president has limited ability to fight back against the higher MFN tariffs now being levied against American workers, farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers. Accordingly, behind the WTO's protective MFN shield, America's free-riding trading partners have little or no incentive to come to the bargaining table to negotiate lower tariffs. To address this non-reciprocity stalemate, President Trump urged Congress in his 2019 State of the Union address to pass the United States Reciprocal Trade Act, USRTA. Under the USRTA, the president would have the authority to bring any American trading partner that is currently applying higher non-reciprocal tariffs to the negotiating table. If that trading partner refused to lower tariffs to U.S. levels, the president then would have the authority to raise U.S. tariffs to match or mirror the foreign partner's tariffs. The USRTA was introduced on January 24, 2019, by then Representative Sean Duffy, RWI. The following month, a Harvard-Harris poll of 1,292 registered voters found that 80% of respondents supported the USRTA. As Representative Duffy noted at the time, the purpose of granting the president these authorities was not to raise tariffs. Rather, it was to give the president, working in close consultation with Congress, a sophisticated and targeted tool that he could use to force other countries to lower their tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Following the introduction of the USRTA, the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, which the author directed, ran simulations to estimate the impact that implementation of the USRTA might have on the overall U.S. trade deficit in goods and the large bilateral trade deficits the U.S. runs with many of its major trading partners. The sample consisted of the same 132 trading partners used in Table 2 above. The results underscore the unfair and unbalanced non-reciprocal trade the U.S. is forced to accept under WTO MFN rules. Two scenarios. Scenario 1 in Table 3 assumes that our trading partners lower their applied tariff rates on specific products to U.S. levels in cases where their applied tariffs are higher. Scenario 2 assumes that our trading partners refuse to lower their tariff rates to match those of the U.S. Instead, in order to uphold the principle of reciprocity, the U.S. raises its tariffs to mirror levels. To calculate the trade deficit reductions under Scenario 1 and Scenario 2, the analysis relied on the World Bank's Smart Tariff Simulator. Table 3 provides the simulation results. In Scenario 1, if all 132 countries were to lower their higher non-reciprocal tariffs to U.S. levels, the overall U.S. trade deficit in goods would be reduced by $58.3 billion, or about 9.4% of that deficit. In contrast, in Scenario 2, if these countries were to refuse to reciprocate and the U.S. were to raise its tariffs to mirror those countries' levels, the reduction in the U.S. trade deficit would be slightly larger, an estimated $63.6 billion, or 10.2% of the deficit. This suggests that implementing the USRTA would help to create between 350,000 and 380,000 jobs. The slightly larger reduction in the trade deficit in Scenario 2 as a result of the U.S. raising its tariffs to mirror those of its partners, as opposed to foreign countries lowering their tariffs to U.S. levels, may seem surprising to those who are steeped in Ricardian dogma and the textbook lessons of free trade. However, this result speaks to the fact that so many of America's trading partners are applying significantly higher tariffs to thousands of American products. Estimated impacts on key U.S. bilateral trade deficits. If the USRTA were enacted, a president would likely have to prioritize which countries he should negotiate with first. One way to create such a priority list would be to choose those countries that have relatively large trade deficits with the U.S. and apply relatively high tariffs. This is illustrated in Figure 1, which maps bilateral trade deficits against tariff differentials for 8 major U.S. trading partners, which account for 47.6% of total U.S. trade and 88.6% of the U.S. trade deficit in goods. Figure 1 shows that the USRTA priority list would include the countries in red, Communist China and India, along with trading partners in the yellow zone. This yellow zone includes the European Union, which features a very high deficit, along with Thailand, Taiwan, and Vietnam, which feature particularly high tariff differentials. Table 4 estimates the improvement in the U.S. trade deficit under Scenario 1, in which partner countries match the U.S. tariff rate under pressure from the American president, and then under Scenario 2, in which the U.S. matches the tariffs of partners that refuse to lower their tariffs. Columns 2 and 4 in Table 4, when the USRTA is applied first to Communist China and then to the EU, show the largest absolute dollar reductions in bilateral trade deficits. This results in bilateral deficit reductions in Scenario 1 of $18.5 billion for China and $8.0 billion for the EU. In Scenario 2, the impacts for Communist China and the EU are substantially larger, $70.6 billion and $25.3 billion respectively. Note further that the largest relative dollar reductions in percent terms come from applying the USRTA first to India and then to Taiwan and Vietnam. For example, if India were to reduce its tariffs to U.S. levels, as in Scenario 1, this would reduce the bilateral trade deficit with India by 24%. If the U.S. raised its tariffs to mirror India's levels, the result would be a far more dramatic 88% reduction in the U.S. bilateral trade deficit with India. Similarly, if Taiwan were to reduce its tariffs to U.S. levels, the size of the U.S. bilateral trade deficit with Taiwan would fall by 6%. If the U.S. imposed a mirror tariff, its bilateral trade deficit with Taiwan would fall by 59%. These results underscore the high degree of unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal trade that currently exists between the U.S. and much of the rest of the world, penalizing American farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and workers because of the WTO-MFN conundrum. These simulations also demonstrate that implementation of the USRTA would most likely substantially reduce the U.S. trade deficit while creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Despite these benefits, the U.S. would still face a substantial overall trade deficit and significant bilateral trade deficits with many of its major trading partners. Why might this be so? Because under WTO rules, America still faces numerous non-reciprocal, non-tariff barriers around the world. For example, one of America's largest trading partners, Japan, runs a significant bilateral trade surplus in goods with the U.S., more than $70 billion a year. While Japan has relatively low tariffs, it ranks high on the non-tariff barrier scale. In such cases, which are numerous, passage of the USRTA would likely also be very helpful in reducing non-tariff barriers. This is because, under the powers provided by the USRTA, if a foreign country imposes significantly higher non-tariff barriers, then the president has the authority to negotiate and seek to enter into an agreement that commits the country to eliminate its non-tariff barriers. If the country refuses to come to the negotiating table and lower its non-tariff barriers, the president has the authority to levy reciprocal duties to offset or mirror those barriers. In summary, passage of the USRTA would go a long way toward leveling the playing field for American farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and workers who are now forced to compete in an intrinsically unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal WTO-MFN system. Nor is the USRTA necessarily the only possible legislative way to address this issue. In 2017, then House Speaker Paul Ryan, RWI, and then House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady, RTX, proposed a border adjustment tax. The proposed border adjustment would have eliminated the ability of corporations to deduct the cost of imports while eliminating the tax on income attributable to exports. This border adjustment tax would have shifted the U.S. corporate income tax from an origin-based tax applying to the production of goods and services in the United States to a destination-based tax applying to the consumption of goods and services in the U.S. This tax, strongly opposed by American multinational corporations and big box retailers, not only would have leveled the playing field with respect to WTO rules, but also would have provided an innovative alternative to the application of tariffs. A conservative administration might do well to look at such a tax as part of its trade agenda. Challenge number 2. Communist China's economic aggression and quest for world domination. Among all of its bilateral trade relationships, America's relationship with Communist China is the most fraught with difficulty. The problem is not just that the relentlessly mercantilist and protectionist trade policies that China has pursued ever since its accession to the WTO in 2001 have led to chronic, massive, and ever-expanding trade deficits. Communist China's economic aggression in the traditional trade policy space is further facilitated by equally aggressive industrial policies and technology transfer forcing policies that are designed to shift the world's manufacturing and supply chains to Communist Chinese soil. The Chinese Communist Party's policy goal is to propel the Chinese economy, but its broader goal is to strengthen Communist China's defense industrial base and associated warfighting capabilities. That China unabashedly seeks to supplant America as the world's dominant economic and military power is not in dispute. Rather, it is a prominent feature of Communist Chinese dictator Xi Jinping's rhetoric. Xi has promised that the deed will be done by 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the communist takeover of the mainland. In light of Communist China's broader geopolitical and military agenda, the American president who takes office in January 2025 must view the U.S.-China trade relationship and associated policy reforms within the context of the broader existential threat posed by Communist China. The question is whether that next president should seek to decouple economically and financially from Communist China as America's first best response to China's unrelenting aggression, or continue efforts to negotiate with an authoritarian country and brutal dictatorship with a well-established reputation for failing to abide by any agreements it enters. Institutionalized aggression. Table 5 depicts more than 50 types of policy aggression institutionalized by the CCP across 6 different categories of such aggression. Viewed as whole, the extent of Communist China's aggression is breathtaking. At the trade policy level, Communist China relies heavily on a wide range of mercantilist and protectionist tools to protect its own markets and unfairly exploit foreign markets. These instruments of Communist Chinese trade aggression include high tariffs and non-tariff barriers, currency manipulation, a heavy reliance on sweatshop labor and pollution havens, the dumping of unfairly subsidized exports, and widespread counterfeiting and piracy. Communist China is the world's largest source of counterfeit and pirated products. In addition, Communist Chinese enterprises benefit from preferential policies that have burdened world markets with subsidized overcapacity. The resultant glut of Communist Chinese exports, in turn, depresses world prices and pushes foreign rivals out of the global market. Steel is a major example. Industrial policy tools that further reinforce Communist China's mercantilist and protectionist trade policies include numerous direct and indirect subsidies to boost exports and the consolidation of heavily subsidized state owned enterprises into national champions that can compete with foreign companies in both domestic and global markets. Communist China also uses a predatory debt trap model of economic development aid that proffers substantial financing to developing countries in exchange for their willingness to mortgage their natural resources and allow Communist China access to their markets. The practical effect of this debt trap model is to give Communist China a competitive edge internationally that stems from its preferential access to relatively lower cost commodities needed in the manufacturing process. These commodities range from bauxite, copper, and nickel to rarer commodities such as beryllium, titanium, and rare earth minerals. As a complement to this debt trap gambit, and to exploit its commanding share of a wide range of critical raw materials that are essential to the global supply chain and production of high technology and high value added products, Communist China strategically uses protectionist export restraints, including export quotas and export duties. These export restraints thereby restrict access to raw materials such as rare earth, tungsten, and molybdenum that are essential in the high technology production space. The result is to drive up world prices and thereby put pressure on American and other foreign downstream producers to move their operations, technologies, and jobs to Communist China. American industries that have been affected by Communist China's export restraints range from steel, chemicals, and electric cars to wind turbines, lasers, semiconductors, and refrigerants. Technology forcing policies. Table 6, extracted from the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy's report on Communist China's economic aggression, provides a summary of the various policies the Chinese Communist Party uses to force the transfer of the West's technologies to Communist Chinese soil. Formally, Communist Chinese industrial policy seeks to promote the digestion, absorption, and re-innovation of technologies and intellectual property, IP, from around the world. As noted in Table 6, this policy is carried out, for example, through state-sponsored IP theft, coercive and intrusive regulatory gambits to force technology transfer, typically in exchange for limited access to the Chinese market. Communist China's looting of American technology is further enhanced by information harvesting conducted by Communist Chinese nationals who infiltrate U.S. universities, national laboratories, and other centers of innovation. Strategic sectors targeted by Communist Chinese economic espionage have included electronics, telecommunications, robotics, data services, pharmaceuticals, mobile phone services, satellite communications and imagery, and business application software. It has been estimated that the theft of trade secrets alone costs the U.S. between $180 billion and $540 billion annually. Closely related to Communist China's espionage campaigns are its state-backed efforts to evade U.S. export control laws. These laws are designed to prevent the export of sensitive technologies with military applications. However, a significant problem facing agencies like the Departments of Commerce, Defense, and State is the growth of dual-use technologies, which have both military and civilian utility. For example, airplane engine technologies have an obvious commercial application. When acquired by a strategic economic and military competitor Like Communist China, however, such commercial items can quickly wind up propelling the aircraft of the People's Liberation Army. As an example of Communist China's coercive and intrusive regulatory gambits to force the transfer of foreign technologies and IP to Chinese competitors, foreign companies often must enter into joint ventures or partnerships with minority stakes in exchange for access to the Chinese market. Once a U.S. or foreign company is coerced into entering a joint venture with a Chinese partner, the door is open to the transfer of technology and IP. Similarly, a relentlessly coercive communist China has forced American patent and technology holders to accept below market royalty rates in licensing and other forms of below market compensation for their technologies, and the American government has done little or nothing about it. Information harvesting. Every year, more than 300,000 communist Chinese nationals attend U.S. universities or are hired at U.S. national laboratories, innovation centers, incubators, and think tanks. To put this in perspective, according to the Chinese Ministry of Education, only 20,000 American nationals were studying abroad at Chinese universities on the mainland in 2018. These Chinese nationals, often members or the sons and daughters of members of the Chinese Communist Party, now account for approximately one-third of foreign university and college students in the United States, and about 25% of graduate students specializing in science, technology, engineering, or math, STEM. As a Defense Innovation Unit experimental DIUX report has warned, academia is an opportune environment for learning about science and technology, since the cultural values of U.S. educational institutions reflect an open and free exchange of ideas. As a result, Chinese science and engineering students frequently master technologies that later become critical to key military systems, amounting over time to unintentional violations of U.S. export control laws. State-backed Chinese enterprises also increasingly finance joint research programs and the construction of new research facilities on U.S. campuses. For example, Huawei, well known within the American intelligence community as an instrument of Chinese military espionage, has partnered with the University of California, Berkeley on research that focuses on artificial intelligence and related areas such as deep learning, reinforcement learning, machine learning, natural language processing, and computer vision, all of which have important future military applications. In this way, UC Berkeley, whether unwittingly or wittingly, helps to boost Communist China's capabilities and quest for military dominance. Communist Chinese state actors are also strategically building research centers in innovation centers and hubs like Silicon Valley and Boston. Such American research has accelerated Communist China's development of hypersonic glide vehicles, which travel at speeds in excess of Mach 5 and are aimed at evading modern ballistic missile defense systems while they deliver their nuclear weapons. Technology seeking, state-financed foreign direct investment, FDI. If American entrepreneurs build it, Communist Chinese investors will come, and come they have in droves. In the words of the United States Trade Representative, the Chinese government directs and unfairly facilitates the systematic investment in and acquisition of U.S. companies and assets by Chinese companies to obtain cutting-edge technologies and intellectual property and generate large-scale technology transfer in industries deemed important by state industrial plans. Communist Chinese buyers have included most prominently state-owned enterprises, private Chinese companies with interlocking ties to the Communist Chinese state, and state-backed sovereign wealth funds. These agents of the Communist Chinese government push their foreign direct investment through vehicles that include mergers and acquisitions, seed and venture capital financing, and greenfield investing, particularly in strategically targeted high technology industries. Since 2012, CB Insights has cataloged more than 600 high technology investments in the United States worth close to $20 billion, with artificial intelligence, augmented and virtual reality, and robotics receiving a particular focus by communist China-based investors. All of these behaviors raise the question of whether communist Chinese nationals should be granted visas to penetrate our universities, think tanks, and research institutions, and whether communist Chinese capital should be allowed to invest in America's cutting-edge technology firms. Policy responses to communist Chinese aggression. It should be clear from this review that communist China's economic aggression is both widespread and systemic. The CCP's self-proclaimed goal is to supplant the U.S. as the world's dominant economic and military superpower. The question, how should the next American president address this aggression? Policy responses range from further attempts to negotiate with the CCP to strategically decoupling economically and financially from communist China. The fruitlessness of further negotiations. If the past is prologue, and as we learned during the Trump administration, any further negotiations with communist China are likely to be both fruitless and dangerous. Fruitless because the CCP now has a very well-established reputation for bargaining in bad faith, and dangerous because as long as the CCP's aggression continues, it will further weaken America's manufacturing and defense industrial base and global supply chains. The record regarding communist China's bad faith negotiating is clear. In September 2015, President Barack Obama stood with Xi Jinping in the White House Rose Garden, where Xi solemnly promised not to militarize the South China Sea and agreed that communist China would not conduct knowingly cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. Within a year, the first promise would be broken. As for communist China's cyber attacks on American businesses, they have never stopped. Upon taking office in 2017, President Trump put on hold his 2016 campaign promise to put high tariffs on Chinese products immediately. Instead, as a gesture of good faith, he sought to negotiate a comprehensive trade agreement with China that would have addressed many of the issues raised in this discussion. By the middle of 2018, it was clear that the CCP had no intention of bargaining in good faith. As a result, on June 15th, President Trump began to impose a series of tariffs on Chinese products that would eventually rise to cover more than $500 billion of Chinese imports. These tariffs would lead Communist China's lead negotiator, Vice Premier Liu He, to agree tentatively in April of 2019 to what would have been the most comprehensive trade deal in global history. On May 3, 2019, however, Liu would renege on that 150-page deal and seek its drastic retrading. Finally, on January 15, 2020, the U.S. and Communist China signed a Phase 1 deal that was a pale shadow of the original deal. This so-called skinny deal, as it was derisively and rightly called, combined proposed modest communist Chinese reforms on issues related to forced technology transfer and intellectual property theft, with promises of large-scale purchases of agricultural, manufacturing, and energy products. To date, This deal has been a predictable bust. Communist China has failed to consummate a significant fraction of its promised purchases and has made little or no progress on reforming its mercantilist, protectionist, and technology transfer forcing policies. The clear lesson learned in both the Obama and Trump administrations is that Communist China will never bargain in good faith with the U.S. to stop its aggression. An equally clear lesson learned by President Trump, which he was ready to implement in a second term, was that the better policy option was to decouple both economically and financially from Communist China, as further negotiations would indeed be both fruitless and dangerous. The following policy options were on the drawing board or in discussion as preparations for a potential Trump second term were being made. These options span the spectrum from purely trade related, like increasing tariffs, to cutting off Communist China's access to American financial markets, research institutions, and consumers. The next American president should strongly consider adopting all of them as a package. Strategically expand tariffs to all Chinese products and increase tariff rates to levels that will block out made in China products, and execute this strategy in a manner and at a pace that will not expose the U.S. to lack of access to essential products like key pharmaceuticals. Provide significant financial and tax incentives to American companies that are seeking to onshore production from Communist China to U.S. soil. Stop Communist China's abuse of the so-called de minimis exemption, which allows it to evade the tariffs for products valued at less than $800. Prohibit Communist Chinese state-owned enterprises from bidding on U.S. government procurement contracts, for example, contracts for subway and other transportation systems. Prohibit the use of Communist Chinese-made drones in American airspace. Ban all Chinese social media apps such as TikTok and WeChat, which pose significant national security risks and expose American consumers to data and identity theft. Prohibit all Communist Chinese investment in high technology industries. Prohibit U.S. pension funds from investing in Communist Chinese stocks. Delist any Communist Chinese stocks that do not meet Public Company Accounting Oversight Board standards, or alternatively, close off the Chinese A-shares stock market to U.S. investment and deregister U.S. sanctioned Communist Chinese companies. Prohibit the use of Hong Kong clearinghouses as transit points for American capital investing in the Chinese mainland. Prohibit the inclusion of Chinese sovereign bonds in U.S. investors' portfolios. Systematically reduce and eventually eliminate any U.S. dependence on Communist Chinese supply chains that may be used to threaten national security, such as medicines, silicon chips, rare earth minerals, computer motherboards, flat screen displays, and military components. Sanction any companies, including American companies like Apple, that facilitate Communist China's use of its Great Firewall surveillance and censorship capabilities. Order the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and Department of Justice to contract with U.S.-owned and U.S.-operated artificial intelligence companies that are capable of detecting, identifying, and disrupting both the domestic groups and CCP influencers' social media operations and funding streams using public information as a rapidly available offensive measure. Reinvigorate and expand the DHS crackdown on the CCP's use of e-sellers, including third-party sellers, and the shippers and operators of major warehouses such as Amazon, eBay, and Alibaba to flood U.S. markets with counterfeit and pirated goods. Compel the closure of all Confucius institutes in the U.S., which serve as propaganda arms of the CCP. Significantly reduce or eliminate the issuance of visas to Chinese students or researchers to prevent espionage and information harvesting. Hold the CCP accountable for the COVID-19 virus, which almost certainly originated as a genetically engineered virus from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and do so through the establishment of a presidential commission or select congressional committee that would investigate the origins of the virus, its various costs, both economically and in human life, and the possible means of collecting damages from the CCP, which are likely to rise to the trillions of dollars. If the new U.S. president wishes to defend this country against the serious existential threat posed by communist China, that president will adopt all of these proposals through the requisite presidential executive orders or memoranda. Effective trade policy in the real world. To conclude this analysis, it is useful to offer brief reflections on a number of key obstacles to implementing the policy initiatives recommended in this chapter. These obstacles include the dogma of the Ricardian free trade model, which has been used as propaganda to thwart the adoption of measures that seek to level the global trading field for American manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, and workers. The politics of trade policy, which has led to a great divide that makes trade policy reforms difficult to implement. The economics of trade deficits, which are not adequately understood either by the American public or by the policy-making intelligentsia. And the crucial role of supportive White House and administration personnel in implementing effective trade policies. The dogma of free trade. Clearly, the fair and balanced trade orientation of this chapter runs starkly against the free trade grain of the globalist Ricardian orthodoxy, which is predicated on the theory that free trade represents the best path by which to achieve both American and global prosperity. This orthodoxy is based on the ivory tower academic conclusion that if countries trade freely among each other, each will pursue its own comparative advantages. Production will be most efficient around the world. The economic pie will be bigger both for the globe and for each free trading country. And so long as workers who lose their jobs are fairly compensated from the gains from trade, everyone will be better off. The most obvious problem with this orthodoxy, there are many more, is that nowhere is Ricardian free trade mirrored in the real world. Instead, America trades in a world where the WTO's MFN rules are stacked against us. Scofflaws like Communist China run roughshod over what meager WTO rules there are, and the United States, among all of the world's developed nations, is the biggest victim of the free trade Ricardian orthodoxy. During his first term, President Donald Trump preached that there can be no free trade without fair, reciprocal, and balanced trade. He was right then, and whoever is the next president in 2025 should heed this critical principle whenever the flag of free trade is waved to prevent the adoption of needed reforms. The politics of trade policy. Who benefits? Today, there's a great divide among Americans that stands in the way of constructive trade policy reforms. This great divide is certainly not about a partisan desire for low taxes and a reduced regulatory burden. Rather, it is over whether our borders should be open or secure, and whether it is prudent to offshore our manufacturing and defense industrial base and associated supply chains. Those who support secure borders and seek to onshore more of American production and supply chains do so to boost the real wages of American workers and to enhance our national security. Some Americans historically have supported open borders and offshoring under the flag of the Ricardian trade model, which assumes the free flow of both labor and capital. Yet it is equally true that open borders and offshoring also help American multinational corporations to maximize their profits by minimizing their labor and environmental protection costs. In particular, an open border policy which allows for the unlimited migration of cheap labor depresses American wage rates and thereby boosts corporate profits. At the same time, offshoring gives American corporations readier access to the sweatshops and pollution havens of Asia and Latin America. Our skies and water may be cleaner and our products may be cheaper. Main Street manufacturers and workers bear the brunt of these policies. The obvious political problem in adopting many of the policies proposed here is that they will be opposed by the special interest groups that benefit from open borders and offshoring and that contribute lavishly to both political parties. These special interest groups range from the hedge funds of Wall Street and tech entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley to big box retailers that stuff their aisles, particularly with cheap, made in China goods. Yes, trade deficits matter. Our country has been behaving like an extraordinarily rich family that possesses an immense farm. In order to consume 4% more than we produce, that's the trade deficit, we have day by day been both selling pieces of the farm and increasing the mortgage on what we still own. Warren Buffett. Historically, one line of attack against attempts to implement fair trade policies in the name of reducing America's massive and chronic trade deficit has been the claim that trade deficits don't matter. The intellectual tip of this spear has often been think tanks that generate reams of analyses in support of a purely free trade and open borders American posture. Yet both common sense and several very good reasons tell us that trade deficits matter a great deal. Economic security. The economic security argument that trade deficits matter begins with the observation that growth in any country's real, inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, GDP, depends on only four factors: consumption, government spending, business investment, and net exports, the difference between exports and imports. Reducing a trade deficit through implementation of the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Act, the application of tariffs, or renegotiating a bad trade deal like NAFTA all represent ways to increase net exports and thereby boost the rate of economic growth. Suppose, for example, that under the USRTA, the American president persuaded India to reduce its very high protectionist tariffs and Japan to lower its formidable non-tariff barriers. America would surely sell more Florida oranges, Washington apples, California wine, Wisconsin cheese, and Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The resultant fall in the trade deficit would increase America's GDP, and the real wages of blue-collar America would rise from Seattle and Orlando to Sonoma and Milwaukee. But that's not all. Consider, too, the investment term in the GDP growth equation. When U.S. companies offshore their production to chase cheap labor or manufacture in a pollution haven, country like communist China or India with lax environmental regulations, the result is reduced non-residential fixed investment and a GDP growth rate that is lower than it would be otherwise. Moreover, if such offshored production results in more foreign exports to the U.S., for example, an American consumer buys a made-in-Mexico Dodge Journey or Chevrolet Trax rather than a vehicle assembled in Detroit, the trade deficit rises along with the fall in investment, further reducing GDP growth. National security. The national security argument that trade deficits matter begins with America's national income accounting double entry system and this accounting identity. Any deficit in the current account caused by imbalanced trade must be offset by a surplus in the capital account, meaning foreign investment in the U.S. In the short term, this balance of payments equilibrium may indeed not matter, as foreigners return our trade deficit dollars to American shores by seemingly benignly investing in U.S. government bonds and stocks. Of course, this infusion of foreign capital lowers American mortgage rates and keeps the stock market bullishly capitalized, which appears to be all to the good. Over time, however, running large and persistent trade deficits leads to a massive transfer of American wealth offshore into foreign hands. This wealth transfer happens as foreigners use their export dollars to buy American real estate, companies, and financial assets like the aforementioned stocks and government bonds. The American investor Warren Buffett has referred to such wealth transfers offshore as conquest by purchase. To Buffett, the big danger is that foreigners will eventually own so many U.S. government bonds that Americans will wind up working longer hours just to survive and service that foreign debt. There is an even bigger national security danger, however, that Mr. Buffett has missed: an alternative conquest by purchase scenario. Suppose, for example, that one of the biggest holders of U.S. dollars is a rapidly militarizing strategic rival like Communist China that is intent on world hegemony. By buying up America's companies, technologies, farmland, food producers, and key elements of the domestic supply chain, Communist China can thereby gain more and more control of the U.S. manufacturing and defense industrial base. In this scenario, might America thereby lose a broader war for America's freedom and prosperity, not by shots fired, but by American cash registers ringing up made in China products? Might America even lose a broader hot war because it sent its defense industrial base abroad on the wings of a persistent trade deficit? It follows that for both economic and national security reasons, trade deficits do indeed matter. It is therefore of critical importance that we bring America's global trade back into balance through free, fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade, and that we do so through the kind of policy initiatives and reforms recommended in this chapter. Personnel is trade policy. Having a clear set of trade and industrial policies to achieve one's economic and national security goals, while essential, is not enough. The lessons of the Nixon, Reagan, and Trump administrations teach us that personnel is policy, or, in this case, that bad personnel will mean bad trade policy. That is why it will be equally critical to the next president's trade policy agenda to have key personnel in place who not only have the skills to implement the policies, but also have the firm commitment to do so. During the Trump administration, President Trump's key policy advisors and cabinet officials clashed on the issues of international trade and combating Communist China's economic aggression. As much as President Trump did on the trade front that was bold and innovative, and as much as he achieved by challenging Communist China, too much of his trade policy was disrupted or derailed by key personnel who did not share the president's vision of fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade. In thinking about the personnel positions that are most essential to effective implementation of trade policy, The most obvious position to get exactly right is that of the United States Trade Representative. The USTR is at least putatively the top official on trade policy, and it is critical that this position be filled wisely. Historically, during Republican administrations, the USTR has been a free trader who rarely challenged the protectionist and mercantilist policies of America's trading partners and typically would seek to expand global trade. The Trump administration broke this globalist Republican tradition by appointing as USTR attorney Robert E. Lighthizer, who not only had a keen understanding of the various legal levers a president can use to advance trade policy, but also was committed to the president's fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade agenda. The next administration should make every effort to find someone with that understanding and that commitment to fill this position. Less obvious, but almost as important, is the need to fill the position of Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade USLI. One of the most important functions of the International Trade Administration, which is an agency in the Department of Commerce, is to impose anti-dumping and countervailing duties against trade cheaters who dump products below cost into American markets or unfairly subsidize their exports. In fact, much of the cheating that does take place in the global trading arena can be addressed through such anti-dumping AD and countervailing duty CVD cases. Within the West Wing itself, it is equally critical that the National Security Advisor, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, CEA, and the director of the National Economic Council, NEC, all be aligned on trade policy. During the Trump administration, with the notable exception of the president's third National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, and third CEA chairman, Tyler Goodspeed, this regrettably was not the case. Finally, and perhaps surprisingly, the Secretary of Defense plays a key role in trade policy, at least when it comes to advancing Section 232 cases. Under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the President has the authority, through tariffs or other means, to reduce imports from other countries if the President determines that such reduction or elimination would threaten to impair the national security. As a practical matter, the Secretary of Commerce spearheads any Section 232 cases, but in order to proceed with a Section 232 case, Commerce must obtain sign-off from the Secretary of Defense. When President Trump wanted to implement steel and aluminum tariffs, he had a willing servant in Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross. However, Secretary of Defense James Mattis resisted. Mattis simply did not understand a key tenet of the Trump administration. Economic security is also national security. Without vibrant steel and aluminum industries, it will be difficult for America to provide the Pentagon with the kind of weapons it needs to defend the homeland. Conclusion. A Harvard professor once told me during my doctoral thesis days that if I tell you how it is, I've told you why it can't change. Despite the obvious exploitation of American farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and workers by the international trading system and communist Chinese aggression, powerful political forces nonetheless exist that profit from the status quo. The stark lesson of this chapter is that America gets fleeced every day in the global marketplace, both by a predatory communist China and by an institutionally unfair and non-reciprocal WTO. Addressing these two challenges would go a long way toward restoring American greatness, both economically and militarily. Ignoring these two challenges will simply continue the parasitic draining of the American manufacturing and defense industrial base.